I don't know if you know what a PLF is, a program life form. We have been making these since after World War II. They are genetic experiments, and they pass very well as aliens. And I know the facilities where we've been making these. And often, the classified projects that are trying to frighten the public, and I know men who have been on these assault teams. They're called abduction teams, but it's an assault team. And one of the institute, a private institute, I got a very secret document that describes this, and they describe the stagecraft of using not only program life forms, but also men in things that look like very good uniforms to be on ARVs, these alien reproduction vehicles, using psychotronic and radionic systems to engage people and have a pseudo-contact experience. It's very frightening. There's a lot that I've written on this. And by the way, Martin Cannon here in the 80s, although he's now since disappeared, had a 2,000-page collection of very good research on this. And a lot of this information I then got to a man in, I think, the United Kingdom who wrote a book called MELAB, Military Abductions. And this is part of the conditioned response because they need people to have something to hate and be afraid of. It's just like, I don't know if those of you who study World War II, how Hitler and Goebbels and how they were very, very good at demonizing Jews. And they even showed them, as these caricatures. And of course, they were going to rape your women folk and steal your baby. And their blood would be used in matzah meal on Passover and all this kind of stuff. And of course, none of it's true. But it was highly effective in creating a mob mentality in the public of hate and fear that could then support the war effort, because it's not like a handful of people did the Holocaust, contrary to what people would have you believe. There was a lot of cooperation. And also, the public had to look the other way as the Mercedes-Benz pulled up next to the Jewish industrialist home and they were hauled off to Auschwitz. But to get people to that level, I'm being quite direct since you asked this question, the big game since the World War II era has ended has been the next level of super system trapping, racist super system trapping, which requires an enemy. And even if you say, oh, well, they're all great ETs except this one race who happens to look this way or sound this way or what have you, it's still a racist and completely unfounded point. Now, I'm not saying that no one has had an encounter where they weren't startled or frightened, but they certainly haven't been harmed. And the things that are interesting, if you look at the abduction research industry, which is a very big industry, they're funding, the men that I know, or the ones that you know as household names, were getting their funding from the Bank of Liechtenstein, the Liechtenstein family, which were the primary funders of the Third Reich, as you know, much more so than the Swiss, or even Ford or Watson at IBM or any of those guys. And so there's this sort of interesting international collective of, I call them transnational fascists, that very much want to grow, in the post-World War II era, they wanted to grow a new kind of war. And what they couldn't do overtly with the Third Reich, they've done covertly. But the psychological warfare value of this is to put out a lot of frightening information to people. And so I'm not saying that no one's had contact that startled them, but the sort of things that are put out in the mass media and the public on this are really false. So I think that and this is stuff that we have this positive proof for. Not only witnesses who have been on, I know an Army Ranger, for example, a couple of them, who have been on these abduction squads. And this one said, you have no idea how many people we've done this to, so that there would begin to be this new myth that would support Star Wars, and that even senior military and political figures have had this happen, so that they would begin to hate these visitors. And Hollywood is very infiltrated by these interests, and this is why to get a movie done of Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which would be a fantastic true story to make a screenplay, if any of you are screenplay writers. But when I've met with some of the top people in Hollywood, they get their funding cut off when they want to develop that project. But if they want to make Independence Day, where Will Smith says, let's go kick alien butt. And the theme of it was the whole world was going to be united. And if you look at that movie, you had people in Africa and you had the Middle East, and they were all getting united. They'd been fighting each other. Now they were going to unite against a threat from outer space. So they were going to grow the war machine from a international level of fighting. It used to be tribal, and then nation state, or city state, and then nation state. Now they want to grow it global. And to do that, you have to have an enemy. Obviously, you cannot justify a multi-trillion-dollar warfare system in space unless you have convinced and brainwashed and done the psychological warfare preparation for that. And this is what Wernher von Braun said on his deathbed to one of our witnesses, who was his personal spokeswoman for the last 5 years or 4 years of his life. She said that he just came clean and said, look, this is what the agenda's been since he was brought in under Operation Paperclip from Hitler's rocket V2. He built the V2 rocket and then became the core of the space program in the United States. But this was the agenda that was being hashed all the way since the late 40s all through the 60s. And by certainly that time, they had the means to effect this. Now, one of our chief projects have been to brief senior military and government people who are not in the loop on these classified projects, because they're very shadowy, very compartmented, and access is very limited, so that they know that this agenda is in a sense, a cosmic Gulf of Tonkin strategy. If you remember the Gulf of Tonkin, we basically staged attacks on our vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin and Vietnam so we could justify a buildup of the war. And he was there, and I know a lot of men who were there, and it was what's called a false INW. If you study war planning, it's a false indication and warning, or a deceptive indication and warning. And these deceptive indications and warnings are very effective because they fool people. Now, one of my chief jobs has been in terms of protecting the consciousness of Earth so that we don't get stampeded into, as Douglas MacArthur said to Congress in the 60s, and there's a transcript of this, the next World War, World War III, will be interplanetary war. This is a quote. Now, this is where they've been trying, the warmongers and the money whores, and all, they want to move things in that direction. And I'm saying, oh yeah, well, they can only do that if people are deceived. Now, most people who've studied this issue have absorbed into their consciousness deceptive indications and warning type of stagecraft. And so that I would say somewhere between 90 and 95% of everything that is extant out there in the literature, videos, UFO circuit, what have you, Coast to Coast AM, is deceptive indications and warnings. Now, the purveyors of it may not know that they're just, lackeys of that. They may not know this. But it's been my job to penetrate these projects and know this. And of course, other people have as well before I came along, such as Martin Cannon, who had thousands of pages of documentation of this. But once he started talking about it, he was blacklisted from all UFO conferences. He was blacklisted, and that happens very much so. I know people who have been part of the Intruders Foundation and Bud Hopkins abduction group, that if they come in with a story that's not a MELAB, that's very frightening and negative, they are shown the door and are not allowed to talk. And his executive director, called me up back in the 90s and says, Dr. Greer, you're absolutely right. We know that a lot of these are clearly have covert military involvement, but it's completely being covered up. So then you have to find out where they're getting their money and funding from. And when you follow the money, it's not hard to figure it out. So that's been part of what we've had to do. Now, what I tell people is that, all right, all that stuff, you got to know the lay of the land. We're staying with the things that are the truth, and that's the positive future for humanity. And a point I make it to people is that on a scientific basis, these things don't stand up to scrutiny. And here's why. First of all, any civilization that was, these horrible things, they could just simply eliminate all life on Earth that they didn't want here in a fraction of a second with the kind of technologies that and allow for interstellar travel. Secondly, they don't need the Earth. There are millions, if not billions, of planets that have biospheres like Earth that don't have advanced civilizations on them. So this sort of fantasy that they're here because there's something here they can't get. You can travel through interstellar space. You can materialize and dematerialize things. There's no element, nothing here. This is why Zecharia Sitchin is all wrong about the early connections with the Anunnaki or whatever, and needing to have us as slaves for gold. I mean, good grief. I mean, the technologies that allow for interstellar travel, you can have any element made. In fact, I know a guy with about a 3,000 to 5,000 degree plasma reactor that is making transmutation of the elements today on Earth with really kind of primitive stuff. And so, you would not need to go through interstellar space and turn a bunch of early humans into slaves to be mining gold. But again, this is all a tribalistic paranoia. And people buy into it because we are emerging from a time of global conflict and tribal paranoia and conflict and racism. And so it's very easy to use that to then get people psychologically adapted for the next level of conflict. And I tell people, just don't be deceived. Very important not to buy into those things. The other thing is that you look at this thing, well, they need our sperm and egg. Well, actually they don't, because even in the really advanced classified genetics engineering programs that have been going on for decades, believe me, we were cloning and doing genetic stuff with, if Dolly the sheep was not the first cloned mammal that you hear about. There are classified projects in the Dulce complex up near Four Corners and other places that have been going on for decades. I know a man in the 60s who was in a program like that, and they were growing all these different kinds of life forms in there from basic materials. So all they'd have to do is retrieve a hair follicle or anything. They wouldn't need to drag someone kicking and screaming on board a spacecraft to snatch their egg and your sperm. I mean, if you have a high school level of genetics at this stage of biotechnology. I mean, my daughter, who's at UCSF doing her PhD, we talk about it, we just laugh. Because, I mean, even human technology would obviate the need for such a clumsy endeavor. But it does sow the same seeds of fear, because think about it. We still have tribalistic attacks going on this planet. And if you look at what's going on in Darfur, I mean, you have one tribal race attacking another, where their women folk are being raped and the children taken out into sexual slavery. So they want to use that leitmotif to disinform and scare people, because it hits a very primal, almost encoded tribalistic fear that is beyond rationality. But when you study it and stand back and look at it, and you see this, it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz, when they found out it was this old man behind the curtain pulling all these levers. So much of this phenomenon that people report is like this this whole gray man behind the curtain pulling all these levers, and it's immensely effective to most people, because they haven't had the ability to penetrate what these projects are about. Now, that's one of the chief things we've tried to do in the last 15 years, is separate out how much of this is disinformation and how much of it is actual events that's extraterrestrial. And so you have multiple phenomena going on. There's the extraterrestrial events that can be very unusual, of course, because the manifestations of an interstellar civilization is not going to look like 20th century or 21st century Earth technology. You have people confusing encounters with astral beings that are not extraterrestrial but are very real, and thinking they're extraterrestrial, because we live in the space age, so they conflate that experience with ETs. Then you have this human deception project that's very well funded and quite sophisticated, with the electronics they have and the alien reproduction vehicles that look like UFOs and would pass to the average person as, wow, that's really an ET thing. It couldn't be made on Earth because it doesn't have a propeller or a jet engine. Not true. We have had things that look like UFOs since at least the 50s that have been test flown. And I have photographs from the late 50s and 60s, one taken by a Navy captain that was absolutely an alien reproduction vehicle that was using anti-gravity. And one of the scientists we're working with actually helped build the early coils, the high voltage coils that allow for mass cancellation effect and the levitation of these objects back in the 60s as they got better and better. So you have that phenomenon, and all of it gets thrown into this sort of collection and mixed together. So discernment is very important, and without the discernment, you're lost. But how do you get the discernment? That's a big part of the series of these 3 books that we put out, is all that information in there.